Colin, thanks for coming on again. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, I'm from England. I moved to the United States in 1990. I used to, before I came here, I was teaching at Oxford, and then I taught at Rutgers University, though I lived in Manhattan, and now I live in Miami.
Cool. So today's topic was about, can we know the mind of God, about different concepts relating to how the mind of God works in your perspective. Could you tell us a little bit about your position relating to that?
Well, the paper that you're referring to was a bit of a one-off for me. It's not a subject I usually work on. I have worked on philosophy of mind, of course, but not on philosophy of religion or theology. I'm not an expert in that field at all. But I was asked to give a paper at a conference, and so I came up with that paper where I applied my philosophy of mind expertise to the question of what's the nature of God's mind. That's how that paper came about.
And what are your positions on the God's mind in general, how it works? Because I think there's a lot of that most theists probably wouldn't think that God's mind works very similar to ours. I think specifically like the Thomistic philosophers think that God's mind is unchanging, pure aseity or something. And I don't think, from my perspective, that doesn't really make much sense. So how do you envision God mind working in some analogous sense?
Well, I actually begin the paper by comparing my question with what's called comparative psychology, where you compare the human mind to animal minds. Animal minds differ quite a bit from human minds, as indeed they differ from each other. The mind of a chimpanzee is not the same as the mind of a boa constrictor. The mind of a wasp is not the same as the mind of an elephant. Minds are different. There are universal features. That's why we call them all minds. We're getting in close to a philosophical question now, which is what's the definition of mind, and how broadly should it be understood? But they're generally thought to be features that are universal to everything called mind. So, for example, consciousness is thought to be probably a necessary condition of being a mind. There's a question of whether thinking is universal to all minds. Probably not. Is desire universal, or need? There are various questions. Now, in the case of supernatural beings, we don't just have God, of course. We've also got the full range of supernatural beings, from fairies and elves, through angels and demigods, and the gods of the Greeks. Obviously the mind of the Greek gods. The Greek gods had minds very similar to human minds, very similar, identical, you might even say. So in the case of the Judeo-Christian view of God, the generally accepted position is that God is a person or a self, equipped with reason, will, disapproval or approval, obviously moral judgment. So you've got consciousness, so you've got all these features. So if God is be said to have a mind at all, he will have some subset, or perhaps all of those characteristics, because otherwise it would make no sense to say that God had a mind anyway. I suppose some people might say that it doesn't make sense to say that God has a mind, because that's inescapably a humanistic or terrestrial concept. But I think that's not a very defensible position. We have a pretty clear idea what kind of mind God has in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So, and the attributes of God's mind are very similar to ours. The main difference, of course, is that God is supposed to be an infinite being. As Berkeley said, of an infinite spirit, where we're only finite spirits. And we exist in space and time. And so, but God, we're told, doesn't exist in space and time. So, but apart from that, it would be generally thought that God has reason, will, those kinds of things, intelligence, the capacity to think logically. for example. So if we just accept those things, then we can easily move from necessary truths about those characteristics to what must be true of God's mind. So let's take the case of consciousness. It's the easiest one. If a being is conscious, there's something it's like to be that being. If God is conscious, there's something it's like to be God. A particular way. Now, what it's like to be God is not the same as what it's like to be a finite being such as a human, just as what it's like to be a bat is not the same as what it's like to be a human. So that means, of course, the experiential condition of God, how God strikes himself introspectively, is not the same as the way we strike ourselves introspectively, just like the bats and all the other animals. So we can say then that God's consciousness is subjective in that sense. There's something it's like to have it. And then we can move on from there to consider what that's all about, what it is for there to be something it's like. In the case of God, we can ask, for example, well, in our case, what it's like to be us is a function of our senses and the sensations that accompany the visual, the auditory, and olfactory, and so on. God doesn't have senses, apparently, so it won't be that. So presumably what its likeness of God will pertain more to God's reasoning faculties and ours. So maybe what it's like to be God in his reasoning is quite similar to what it's like to be us in our reasoning. So that's a reasonable supposition. I don't think there's anything theologically objectionable about that. It seems perfectly reasonable. But then so we get to that idea, then we can move on, say, to intentionality, another feature of the mind due to Brentano. The mind is always about something, nothing particularly to do with intention, but that's his technical term for aboutness. The mind is thoughts, emotions, desires are always about something. So God's mind has intentionality necessarily, because otherwise it wouldn't be about anything. And then there'd be no point in it. God thinks about something. He has desires for something. He wishes certain things were the case. He intended to send his son to earth. And all of this has intentionality. So then we can talk about the intentionality that God's mind has. Is it the same as ours? Is it perhaps different? So that much the same features which apply to us apply to God's mind. Here's another example. I don't discuss this in my paper, but one of the features of belief that philosophers have pointed out is you can't decide to believe something. And if God has beliefs, and presumably he does because he has knowledge, and knowledge presupposes belief, then God also can't decide to believe something. God can't just suddenly decide, well, I want to believe that human beings are good, so I'm going to believe it. That can't happen. It's a necessary truth. It's impossible. Or another necessary truth, I also don't discuss in the paper, but in the case of intention, you can't intend what you believe is impossible. That's a necessary truth, isn't it? You can see that pretty quickly. You can intend what is impossible because you might not realize it's impossible, but you can't intend what you believe is impossible. So God has his beliefs. He also has his intentions. He also can't intend what he believes is impossible. So whatever necessary truths apply to the mind in general, that means the human mind and the animal mind, since they're necessary, they'll apply to any mind, and that will include the mind of God. So we can make inferences of this kind and build up a picture of what God's mind must be like.
A few questions come to mind. One is that can God imagine himself doing something against his nature? So there's this argument that theists often use that it's impossible for God to do things against his nature, which would then imply it's some kind of logical impossibility. But logical impossible things like a round square, I can't imagine it. It's possible for me to imagine a round square.
Yeah.
But it seems like it would be perfectly reasonable for God to imagine himself lying or something. That seems perfectly rational. And so in the context of his ability to imagine himself doing things that he would normally not do, would he be able to imagine those things? And would that be...
I think he could certainly imagine those things. He can't do the things he imagines because you can't act against your nature. That seems to be a good metaphysical principle. No object organic, inorganic, whatever, can act against its nature, contrary to its nature. Understood as the full nature of the thing in question. But God could. I don't see why God shouldn't be able to envisage or imagine things which are contrary to his nature. I can envisage or imagine things contrary to my nature. To some degree, anyway. I can imagine being able to climb a tree like a leopard. I can't do it, but God might be able to imagine. I mean, there's an interesting question: could God imagine himself acting like the devil? Well, I don't know. It would depend how much we built into him imagining it. I do mention in my paper the question of whether God has an imagination, because if he has an imagination, he has to have images, mental images. And does God have mental images? If he does, they're not sensory images like visual images or auditory images, because God doesn't have senses. Maybe, one of the problems with all this is God is also supposed to have the attribute of omnipotence. So anything is supposed to be possible for God to do, to imagine in the form of visual images, say. That would be a limitation on God to say that. But he doesn't see anything in the way that we do. He doesn't have senses in the way that we do anyway. That would make him a finite being. And as was discussed in the Middle Ages, there are real questions about whether God really can be thought to be omnipotent. Does God have the power to negate the law of non-contradiction? I don't think so. God can never do the impossible, but it's impossible. So God doesn't have the power, for example, to, by fiat, make what is now regarded as a sin or an immoral action, such as murder. You can't just by fiat decide that murder is virtuous. This was the point that was made by Plato, by Socrates, in the Euthyphro, that you can't define what's right as what God decides to be right or asserts to be right. Otherwise, he could assert anything to be right. There are limits on God's omnipotence for sure, because God does not have the power to contradict necessary truth.
Here's a strange question for you. Does God consciously have the ability to determine his nature, or does his nature determine his consciousness? Because it seems like if I have a consciousness, it comes from my brain, and I don't get to choose my brain in any way. My brain determines my consciousness. And so if God does have a consciousness, but supposedly his consciousness is some indelible part of his nature or something, which came first, his nature or his consciousness? Which determines the other?
Well, that's one of those conundrums that arise in theology. Could God cause himself? And if you're thinking about it metaphysically, the answer would be no. Nothing can cause itself. Nothing can be self-caused. So how did God come into being? Well, that's an awkward question for theologians. Let us say, by way of a footnote here, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God at all. And I think these kinds of problems are very strong arguments against the idea of God, because when you push it, it's not coherent, the whole thing, really. In the case of God, we're told God exists for all eternity. He didn't come into existence at any time. He had a nature when he came into existence. His nature was to be God, with the attributes that define that. Well, one of those attributes is omnipotence. So what about, does he have the power then to bring himself? Did he have the power to bring himself into existence when he came into existence? What, from nothing? So there was nothing, not even God. And then somehow he had the power to bring himself into existence from nothing, but he wasn't there. So all these ideas of causation, origin, and so forth just don't really apply. And so the concept itself is extremely suspect.
Can God's consciousness do anything? I'm a determinist or a compatibilist in that I think that everything's determined. I don't really think there is such a thing as a libertarian free will. And if God does have a nature, I think all of his thoughts are going to be determined by that nature. I don't think he has any free thoughts or anything. And so his consciousness seems kind of redundant, seems kind of irrelevant to even have consciousness. Like there wouldn't be any difference between a philosophical zombie God who's just reacting to his nature and pretending to have consciousness as one that does. Is there any reason to believe that God does have consciousness? And if it did, does it actually do anything to have consciousness?
Well, you're raising the question of freedom there, which I mentioned in my paper too. The free will, the classic free will dilemma applies to God's so-called supposed free actions just as much as to any other being, ourselves or animals. Either God's decisions are determined or they're not. If they're determined, they're not free. If they're not, then they're also not free because they're just random. That's the old classic free will problem, and where you get to incompatibilism with respect both to determinism and indeterminism. Free will is incompatible with both if we're thinking of free will in a certain way, in a libertarian kind of way. I actually have a more recent paper where I've thought about the problem of free will for 50 years, longer than 50 years, and had different positions about it. But I came up with a position somewhat recently, last about a year or so ago, that I think satisfactorily handles the problem. So I'm a compatibilist, but in a very specific sense. The sense which is very familiar from Hume and so on is the proper concept of freedom is the ability to do as you desire, as opposed to have somebody else is forcing you, coercing you to behave. And I think that is quite consistent with determinism. In fact, I think not only is it consistent, it entails determinism. So, because if you were not acting according to your desires, on your desires, you wouldn't be free. If something else determined your desires, determined your actions other than your desires, what would that be? That wouldn't make you have free action in any interesting sense. Okay, so that's so far so familiar. So I call that freedom too. So freedom too is compatible with determinism. Determinism is also true, according to me. It doesn't really matter if indeterminism at the quantum level is true. That's irrelevant to freedom anyway, so we can put that on one side. But what is true in the old incompatibilist position is the following. We also have a notion of freedom, which I call freedom from. And if you ask yourself, are human beings in their actions free from the past and their own brains and their own genetics and upbringing? The answer is no. They're not free from it. In that sense of free from, where you talk about when I say to you, let's have coffee later, and you say, I'm not free this afternoon. I'm not free from my obligations. I'm not free, right? So we don't have freedom from the past. That's true. But that doesn't mean we don't have freedom to do as we wish. Freedom too. So my general position about this is that philosophers have got this notion of what they call free will. And that's a philosopher's phrase. In our ordinary thought, we use the word free in many different ways, but one of them is free in the sense of free to do as you wish, and the other is free from various things. And in one sense we have that, in the other sense we don't. In one sense that's compatible with determinism, in the other sense it isn't. And there's nothing further to be said on the subject. So going back to God, if you were to apply that to God, well, you'd say, well, God is not free from his own nature and his own past, if he has a past. He's not free from what's currently true of him, right? He doesn't have a brain, so we can't say whether he's free from his own brain. But he's certainly free to act as he wishes. In fact, God can't be coerced into doing anything, presumably, because he's too powerful to be coerced. So he's freedom to do as he wishes, so he's free. And he's also determined, like everything is determined. And that's my answer to that.
So what would God be free from? Could God be free from everything, or?
Well, he would be, yes. I mean, on the traditional conception, he's free from everything, but let's just consider his own nature. So presumably God has a nature. That's the other thing. God has a nature. Well, is it a physical nature? Apparently not, because he's immaterial. So it's a spiritual nature, but it's a real type of thing, about which we're told we don't know very much. But he has a psychological nature as well. So let's take God at any particular moment of time, looking at it from our temporal point of view. So there'll be various truths applicable to God at that time, like what he desires, what his values are, whatever else, what his memories are, and all the rest of it. And now we ask, is God in his actions and decisions free from all of that psychological material? Well, the answer is no, he's not free from that. Now, look, to put this in the standard way, If you had a twin God, exactly like God, in all of his psychological attributes and other attributes, immaterial attributes, at time t, that God would have to do the same thing as our God would do, given that they're psychological and other twins, because that's determinism, and determinism applies to everything. Now, again, we can say, well, maybe it's indeterministic for God. Okay, but that's not freedom. So I wouldn't make God free. So in the same sense in which we're free, God is free. In the same sense in which we're determined, God is determined. He's not determined by the same things that we're determined by. He doesn't have any genes. He has no upbringing by inadequate parents and so forth. But, you know, he's otherwise the problem is the same. So fortunately, we have a relatively clear, nice and clear and easy way to handle the question of God's freedom.
So what is your take? Because many theists say that God is outside of space-time, but for me, the idea of any kind of intentionality or cognition or thoughts outside of space-time doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Do you think it's possible to have a mind outside of space-time? Is that a coherent concept?
I don't. Well, let's distinguish space and time. Descartes, of course, thought that the essence of mind was thought and that the mind was inherently non-spatial. The essence of matter, of course, is extension, that is spatiality. So Descartes would think that the mind isn't spatial. In the case of, you know, if you're not an immaterialist, you can still raise the same question about the mind, the human mind. Is the mind, like the brain, a spatial entity? Well, on the face of it, it's not, because you can't say that thoughts are 2 inches long, you know, or things like that, or occupy a certain volume of space. So we can make sense seemingly we can make sense of the idea that minds are non-spatial. That doesn't mean that they exist outside of space. It means that they are non-spatial in themselves, like numbers are non-spatial too. So, you know, let's take the case of numbers. So if we were to say that minds are non-spatial like numbers, and numbers exist outside of space, also supposed to exist outside of time, but well, we might be able to say that about the mind, our minds existing outside of space if it's non-spatial. In the case of temporal, it's no way you can think of the mind as non-temporal. And Descartes never, of course, said the mind wasn't temporal. It's often thought to be, you know, constitutive of consciousness, that it's temporal. So we can't make sense of mind. Now, why is that? Because the mind changes. So you can't make it outside of time. It's caused by things at times and so forth. In the case of God's mind, well, again, we get pushed back into these obscure theological debates about time in relation to God. So if God is said to be timeless, whatever that exactly that means, does it mean that God never changes? I can't make a lot of sense of that. Because the reason for that is that we're already attributing to God various personal characteristics. God has personhood and has a psychology. Well, how are you going to dissociate that from time? Very difficult to see how that goes. You know, did God, at his very inception, infinitely long ago, already have the plan of sending his son to Earth to be our savior? Or did he come up with it later? Well, I mean, neither of those seems to be quite what one wants to say theologically, but my intuition would be to say, no, he thought of that later. You know, he saw how humans with their free will were, you know, misusing their free will from the Garden of Eden onwards. So he said, I've got to do something about this, and I'm going to send down my son, and I'm going to see how it goes, you know. And so that's how Christianity came into existence. So it was a somewhat late in the day plan that God had, and that makes more sense to me. Because all of this is all predicated on a Western quasi-Platonic metaphysical theology that is highly questionable. In other traditions, like the Greeks I mentioned earlier, none of this is supposed to be true there. First of all, there's polytheism. So, and also in the case of God, you see, which is meant to be monotheistic, of course, it's only partially monotheistic, even in our very Western tradition, isn't it? Because Jesus is supposed to be God as well. And God has all sorts of enablers and assistants, angels and so on, that are also divine beings, the Virgin Mary and so forth. So there's still an element of polytheism in there. So we could ask the same question about time in relation to angels and the Virgin Mary too, I suppose. It all just gets very obscure, and that's something where those of us who are not religious think, well, yes, you can't make sense of all of this.
Wouldn't that cause a conflict with the omniscience aspect, that if he made a decision later based on some new information or something, that would mean he has to have learned something he didn't know before?
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's the same kind of problem too. Does God at time t know everything he will know or think at some later time? Well, if not, he's not omniscient. I've actually written a little bit about omniscience, because I think that's a very problematic. Not only is omnipotence a problematic idea, omniscience is a problematic idea. So God is meant to know everything. So he knows every trivial last thing in the universe, the exact position of every particle at any moment of time in any galaxy. Well, why does he bother to know that? What's the reason that he'd want to know that? We usually, when people tell you about omniscience, it's all about he knows what's going on in your soul, so you better keep it pure and so forth. But they forget about all the junk knowledge he must have if he's really omniscient, and does he really know everything about what it is to be evil? Can't there be some things the devil knows that God doesn't know, doesn't want to know? It's all a bit obscure. Does God know what orgasms are like? Well, if he's omniscient, yes. Maybe he designed orgasms, and that's the usual idea. But it doesn't sound theologically right to say that God has that kind of knowledge. Because again, one of the points is, of course, another a priori truth in the philosophy of mind is there are certain things where you can't know what they're like unless you've had them. So the blind man can't know what seeing red is like. The person who's never had an orgasm can't know what having an orgasm is like. Well, God hasn't had an orgasm that I've ever heard of. So he knows what it's like, really? How? How does he know what it's like? He never had one. And isn't that the only way you can know? It all dissolves into confusion, and right, as long as you take everything literally and push it. If you ignore all these questions and, oh yes, he's omniscient, so he knows all about what's going on in my soul, I better be careful, and you ignore everything else, it sounds plausible, but that's not the official doctrine, right? And then of course there's the question that God is all moral as well as everything else, and then everybody knows the problem of evil there. So again, it's these alleged defining characteristics of God are very dubious when you start to examine them.
Yeah, one of the ones I've found most interesting is the Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that any set of logical systems is going to necessarily be incomplete. You can't use the system to prove itself. And so God's mind would seem to have the same kind of a problem. And I think the second one of Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that any system is going to have unresolvable sentences. And so that would also have to apply to God too.
Yeah.
So if his mind is some kind of a logical structure model, then it's going to be unable to prove itself, and it's going to have incomplete sentences, which seems like it's going to have the same problem of lack of knowledge as any logical system.
Yeah, I mean, these are all reasonable points. I mean, any reasons why the human mind must be finite, because the questions of infinity are also very problematic. So if God has at any given time, from our temporal point of view, a state of knowledge at that time, does he also have the knowledge of that state of knowledge at that time? And does he then have the state of knowledge of that knowledge, and so forth? It's hard to see what it's all about. In my paper, I try to avoid these kind of theological conundrums and stick to something where we could be reasonably sure. One thing I said there that I remember one person, when I gave the paper, questioned me about it afterwards. I said that God has no personality, and and this young woman who was questioning me, other people seemed to agree. But I meant something there. I mean, this is a relatively decidable, though perhaps not uncontroversial, type of question. Of course, God's supposed to have personhood and has desires or wishes or values. That's all true. He has a psychological profile, but personality, as psychologists mean it, is not just that. It's not. They're not investigating a person's psychological profile. They're investigating another thing called, somewhat technically perhaps, personality, and they list various characteristics as constituents of what having a personality, like neuroticism, openness to experience, extroversion and introversion, things like that. Now, those kinds of they're things on which people differ. That's why they're interesting to psychologists. They're individual differences. In the case of God, it sounds to me distinctly wrong-headed to think that God has got those kinds of characteristics. Right? Is that, you say, is God introverted or extroverted? What? He's not. It's a category mistake, right? He's not. He isn't. Is he open to experience? Well, he doesn't have experiences to be open to. He's not, and it's not the case of God.
Well, actually, I like that one a lot because I think that one causes a contradiction.
It's not. There's no neuroticism level or anything like that. So I don't think he has a personality. There's also the questions like, does God dream? And I think we can give a reasonably good answer to that without getting completely embroiled in these theological conundrums. And the answer is God does not dream. He doesn't sleep. What would he dream about? And his mind would be chaotic and ungodlike if it was in a dreamlike state. Unless we mean by dream something completely different from what we normally understand by a dream, then that's another matter. So, some of this is due to the fact that, if God is a fictional entity, there are always going to be limits on what we can say about the mind of a fictional entity. I mentioned Sherlock Holmes. There's certain things we know from the stories of Sherlock Holmes about Sherlock Holmes' psychology, but many things we don't know about him. And if we try to ask ourselves about these things, we don't get an answer. A point that philosophers have often made about fictional characters is you don't know whether a certain fictional character has a mole, like Hamlet. Does Hamlet have a mole in the middle of his back? There's no answer to that question, right? You can't say that he does. You can't say that he doesn't. Why? Because Shakespeare doesn't say anything about that. And that's the only test, only criterion for what a fictional character is like. But the same is true of psychology. So we don't know, did Sherlock Holmes like his mother, love his mother or not? Did he have a good relationship with his father? I don't think we're ever told anything about that. What does he think of, football? And there's no discussion of that. So there's no answer. So in the case of God, we're dealing with an entity which is at least like a fictional entity, where sometimes we just not able to give any answer.
I think the experience thing also causes some contradictions with the omniscience property, because if God's omniscience and he knows everything, does he know what it's like to not know something? Does he know what it's like to learn something new? And if he doesn't know those things,
it's hard, isn't it? Does he know what it is to be ignorant? Does he understand what ignorance feels like? Hard to say what that would be. Does he know what it's like to desire to kill? Does he know what a sadist feels like? And it's still all very hard to. You feel uncomfortable because the image you have of God is God's not supposed to know things like that. He's pure. He doesn't have that. You don't want to think of God, thinking about these things in order to know about them, and having that kind of knowledge. It doesn't seem right. In the case of beings who are supernatural but not godlike, like the Virgin Mary kind of case, we certainly don't want to say that about those kind of things. She's not omniscient about all these horrible things, but she's divine. It's the omniscience, understood very strictly, that leads to these kinds of problems. If you were to say that God has got certain types of knowledge which we don't have, for example, the ability to peer into our minds, which is the crucial one, really, from the point of view of religion, the Christian religion, that's okay. You don't have to assert complete omniscience to say that, and that's all you really need for the theology. Same with the omnipotence point. You don't have to assert complete omnipotence, universal omnipotence. You just say, well, he can do many things that we can't do, but we don't have to make the very strong claim that he's absolutely omnipotent or absolutely all good. Come to that, actually.
Yeah, I think the Muslims Muslim interpretation does not entail that God is perfectly good. But
Really? No, that's interesting.
so the next section of your paper was the God world problem. What is the God world problem?
Well, the subject of the conference that I went to was God's intervention in the world, and so I had to say something about it. So I compared the problem to the mind-body problem. It's really just the question of what's the relationship between God and the world, and if you look at the array of theoretical positions of mind and body, you find a strong analogy to the case of God. So, for example, in dualism, say take the Cartesian form of dualism, you've got the material substance of the body and brain, you've got the immaterial substance of the mind, and then there's the question of interaction, in which Descartes, of course, had a problem with that, especially because the mind is non-spatial and the body is spatial. Well, you have an analogous position with God and the world. You can suppose that there's the world as a substance on one hand, and that includes physical and mental substance. And on the other hand, you've got the divine substance, and there are two main substances in reality: the divine, and then the supernatural and the natural. Spinoza thought there was only one substance, and God was God, but it was also the world. So you've got that type of position. But so you've got dualism, and then you've got an interaction problem if you've got dualism. So if you have a dualist view about the God substance and the substance of the world, how does God manage to intervene in the world if he has a completely different nature? You know, how does he, if he's outside of space, for example, how exactly is he influencing things within space? And same with time. But then you get to so that's dualism. Then you get to, you know, the analog of materialism. So in materialism, the idea is that the mind is simply identical to the body. So we get the idea that the God is identical to the world, you know, which is usually called pantheism. And so the world, of course, is far more divine than we thought, because God is in the world. God really is not a distinct thing from the world. Two different ways of talking. You know, people are going to say there's just two different ways of talking about the same thing. You can talk about it in terms of space, time, and matter, and minds, and so forth, or you can talk about it in theological terms. But you're talking about the same thing. And similarly, there are similar kinds of problems in both areas. It seems like in either of these two areas, you don't get a view about the nature of the mind or about God that does justice to what we're supposed to believe about these things. It's too reductive. Right? If God is just the world, then, well, God is made of atoms then, right? And so just like everything else, it's not, the divinity disappears, you see, if you have that. Just like with the mind, if the mind's just the brain, well, subjectivity and intentionality disappear because the brain doesn't have those things. So those are really the main two positions about in philosophy of mind. You solve the interaction problem with God and the mind by this identity theory kind of view. That's true, you do that, but at too great a cost. Then you get sort of sub-varieties of these, like emergence theories, you know, so the mind emerges from the brain, consciousness emerges from the brain. Nobody knows how that happens, you know, it's completely mysterious. It seems to be true. I mean, it does seem to be true, but it's not a satisfactory theory. So also you might think God emerges from the world. And what's the world mean there? Well, it means the universe. Well, how could God, with his divine attributes, emerge from the world? God's got all sorts of attributes that go beyond anything that the world has. So that doesn't seem to work either. Then you've got panpsychism, you know. There's really mind in everything, including atoms. And so you've got pantheism, that there's God in everything, including atoms. And so the God's existence is really a result of the summation of all of these infinite, many separate little gods, you might think, little pockets of godhood. And just as with panpsychism, it's all very unsatisfactory theoretically to say that. How does this process work, and how do we really get from these little particles of consciousness to full-blooded consciousness? How do we get from these little particles of God to God as we're told we should understand him? None of it makes any sense. So, but I say something which is meant to be of some comfort to theologians. Remember, at the conference I was giving, everybody who was there was religious, you know, because they were that's what it was all about. but I was being quite sincere when I wasn't just trying to give them an easy time. You might think, well, this is a problem then with the whole idea of God's existence. You can't come up with any good theory of the relationship between God and the world, which will satisfy the various desiderata of what God has to be like and so forth. But the same thing is true of mind and body. So, and we don't think that shows that mind doesn't exist. Some people do think that, but most people don't think that that's enough. They know that this is a difficult philosophical problem. So the theologian could say, well, I'm in no worse a condition than people are about the mind. The mind-body problem is very difficult to solve. So is the God-world problem very difficult to solve. It's okay. We don't. And then you might even become like me, a Mysterian, and say, well, it's mysterious. In the case of theology, it's a very natural position, of course. There's a mysterious relationship between God and the world. We can't, with our little human minds, hope to understand that. Okay, that's a possible option. So that's something where I think the theologian has got something to say. The further question I discussed has to do with whether God can intervene in the world given determinism, because there's apparently an argument there that says, well, everything in the world is determined by physical laws. How can God intervene so as to change the result of these physical laws and the initial conditions of the universe? That's again is analogous to the problem of how do humans change the world, given that everything is fixed by physical laws and initial conditions. And that's a good philosophical question. And there's a lot of debate about it, and there are answers, and it's typical philosophy. It's you can debate it both ways, and it's not that easy to resolve it. But then I do get to the thing which most people believe about divine intervention, which is there are times when God actually intervenes in the history of the world so as to contravene the laws of physics. So he intervenes in such a way that if an object was falling from a great height to earth under the force of gravity, God sometimes intervenes to prevent it hitting the earth by just stopping it in mid-flight, and change it, making it go in a different direction. In other words, the idea of miracle. So the idea of miracle is the idea of intervention from outside the sphere of causation as we understand it, physics and causation, so as to cause a breach in the laws of physics. And my answer to that is a very standard one, which is there's no evidence that's ever happened. All there is people saying it's happened, that they saw a miracle. But, everybody knows this is an old thing. Hume had the classic answer to this. There's always more reason to doubt the testimony than to believe in the miracle. If it were the case, we have to be open-minded about this. If a great many people witnessed exactly the same miracle, and they told others who went back to the scene of the miracle, scientists and others who were initially skeptics, and they too saw that same miracle, then you rationally could conclude there'd been a miracle. You wouldn't understand it, but I would believe that there was a miracle, and I would probably even believe in God if certain things were to happen, which have never happened, and I don't think ever will happen. But if I suddenly saw in the sky, appearing some writing in the sky, in some text that was no writing has ever been, left by a plane or anything, and a booming voice like no other voice, and this went on, and this voice told me all sorts of things that no human being knows and thought we would ever know, and all the rest of it. I might start thinking, well, perhaps there is a God, and this is God now finally showing himself. But God, of course, has never done anything like that. That's one of the questions, of course, which the skeptics have always had. Why doesn't God show himself? Why does he make it so difficult? If he exists and wants us to believe in him, give us the evidence. Don't make it so hard to find out. Oh, well, then we have to have faith. That's what it's all about. Why do we have to have faith? Why can't we just have rational belief? It makes no sense. All these miracles, so-called miracles that you hear about, they're always, a few people at some point, and it can never be intersubjectively verified, and it never was repeated. And so that's why they're so unbelievable.
Would God's mind itself have a mind-body problem? Like even if you had a mind but you were spiritual as opposed to physical, wouldn't you still have the same mind-body problem? And doesn't God, because he is made up of more things than just mind, he isn't just mind, because there has to be some nature behind that to determine
Yeah,
the properties of the mind. So wouldn't
yeah,
that also have a mind-body problem?
yes. Maybe we shouldn't be using the word body there if we mean by body, what we normally mean by it. But I think your underlying point is absolutely right, which is God presumably can't be just those mental attributes. There must be a kind of machinery behind it. You see, it's something behind it, and that's where the idea of immaterial substance comes in. So, in that way of looking at things, there's something called immaterial substance. It has a nature, and that nature goes beyond the surface characteristics and perhaps explains them. Just like it's analogous to the brain and analogous to matter. It just isn't matter. So then there'd be a question: well, how do the characteristics like consciousness relate to this hidden nature of God's mind? And that would be analogous to the mind-body problem. We wouldn't have what we have in the case of terrestrial minds, the problem of how does the brain, which is made of atoms, things extended in space, how does that generate consciousness, which seems so different? Because we wouldn't suppose that God's nature contained anything like that. We'd think it was immaterial, completely immaterial, therefore not extended in space. And so we wouldn't have that kind of explanatory gap type of problem. But we wouldn't have a solution to the mind-body problem either for God, because we don't have any specification of what that underlying machinery might be like, which would explain why God's mind works as it does and why there's something it's like to be God and so forth. Again, we could become Mysterians about it and say, well, there's lots of things we don't know. There might be, just as physicists tell us that there's dark matter and dark energy, and we know nothing about their nature. Well, there might be dark spirit where we know nothing about its nature too. But what does that prove? It just proves our own limitations. So God might have a nature which is immaterial, but it's dark relative to our modes of comprehension. It's not an intellectually, reprehensible position to say that. It's not a happy position, but it's in logical space. You can see, okay, that's a possibility. It's not a knockdown objection to God, you see, that you can't solve the mind-body problem for God. You can't solve it for us either. You can't solve it for rats and rabbits, either. So there are rats and rabbits and they have minds, but you can't solve the mind-body problem.
Would God's mind act as a solution to the where did consciousness come from problem? Like I know panpsychists and idealists say, oh, consciousness is fundamental. That explains consciousness. But I don't see how proposing that there is already some big consciousness there does anything to actually solve what consciousness is. Just saying it's already there in the first place or something.
Well, it doesn't help tremendously. But again, we don't. If we're fair-minded, we don't have. It's not like we have a solution to that problem, given that we have matter. Matter leaves us with the same problem too. Where does it come from? Where does consciousness come from? It doesn't come from matter. So where does our consciousness come from? Well, we're told it comes from God, but that's not an explanation. It doesn't tell us how that's supposed to happen. I just was have been thinking about and writing something about Berkeley on theology and materialism, which is relevant to this question. Berkeley would say, of course, there's no explanation of how finite spirits like ourselves could derive from matter, understood as Descartes understood it, mind-independent, extended stuff. That kind of thing. The standard view of matter we have now. He would say there's no explanation of that. But in Berkeley's system, there only are finite spirits and the infinite spirit. There is no matter at all. And so presumably in that system, the existence of finite spirits is owed to God. Now, what Berkeley would say about that, now Berkeley's just a straight out traditional theist, so he can help himself to all sorts of ideas. So he would say, well, God's omnipotent, and one of his powers is to be able to create things. He could have created matter, perhaps, and he could create minds, and he did. And it was relatively easy for him to do that, and didn't cause him much creative effort, because he's already one himself. So, and he knows what that involves, being a mind, an immaterial spirit. And so he just created things like himself, but finite. Okay, from a theological point of view, that sounds fine. So we can say that. But what the thought which occurred to me about this was, you can really turn Berkeley's argument round, because Berkeley, he argues quite convincingly that if there is a God, then there's no matter, because matter would lead to skepticism about the external world and so forth. But the other way around, if there is matter, then there is no God. And Berkeley is unintentionally giving a new argument for atheism, which I think is very interesting, because it would go like this, if there really is matter in the sense that Descartes meant it, then God would have to be not the benevolent being which we supposed him to be. And why is that? Because he would leave us saddled with skepticism, because we can never know, just as Descartes said, we can never know about matter if matter exists. So we've got skepticism, and we could even say, if this is not particularly Cartesian, but if we don't know the nature of matter, then we don't even know the nature of what constitutes the perceptible world. Well, God wouldn't leave us in that position. We wouldn't make us skeptics and as ignorant, when he could have created a world which we know about perfectly well. Now, Berkeley thinks we do know about this what he calls the sensible world quite well. We know there's a tree here. We know, they know all these ordinary things. Whereas if we follow Descartes, we don't know those things, right? Because skepticism applies. We don't know them. And that's a good argument, right? If God does exist, then he wouldn't create matter, which would have generated skepticism, which extends to his own existence, makes it much harder for us and easier for infidels, as Berkeley says, to argue for atheism. But changing the argument to go from the other direction, if there is matter, in roughly the way that Descartes meant it, then there's no God. But there is matter. So there is no God. So we can prove the non-existence of God for the existence of matter. Now that argument I've never seen developed by anybody in the atheist agnostic kind of tradition. But if you given Berkeley's overall system, it's a pretty good argument, and I think that Berkeley's system is actually quite insightful in seeing the tension between traditional religion and the existence of matter in the Cartesian sense. That means, of course, our contemporary worldview is wrong. The contemporary worldview has been, you can happily have matter, and physics studies matter as a mind-independent, stuff that's out there. At the same time, it's possible to be religious. That's what people have thought, right? Many physicists have held that position. But I think that in the end is wrong. You can't combine those two things. But I don't go in Berkeley's direction.
Well, I would have a problem with that argument, because I would say that most theologians would probably say that God has some direct link to your brain, and he can reveal information to you. And so you wouldn't still be an external world skeptic or have skepticism to that degree, because you have some other basis to gain knowledge, which is the direct revelation of God. And so you don't need to have a direct experience of matter, or be able to go from your sense experience to the external world via that means of the Cartesian dualism, because we have this other means of direct contact to God's revelation or something. And so I wouldn't say that simply because matter would exist in a non-direct relationship between our consciousness, and so we couldn't get to the external world via that means, that would invalidate God, because God could give us a different means to do that, which would be through his revelation or something.
Well, we could suppose, just like Descartes did, that God is not a deceiver, and God would not make things such that we're wrong about reality. He wouldn't do that to us. The problem is that Berkeley's pointing out, I think insightfully pointing out, is that yes, but if you think about the metaphysical system that Descartes has, it consists of, on the one hand, matter, which is completely non-spiritual and mind independent. On the other hand, it's got spirit, including God. But that matter, which you can think you conceive of in that way, is something which raises the problem of skepticism. So you're going to be tormented with that problem. And then it'll be possible for the infidels to say, look, we don't even know that. So if we don't know that, how can we know that God even exists? And then we have to take on that burden, you see, of trying to prove that God exists. Descartes thought he had to prove that God exists using the ontological argument. So the problem of skepticism will arise if you believe in matter. But it doesn't arise, you see, if you believe in Berkeley's idealist system. It doesn't arise there at all, because there's nothing there that we don't know. It's nature we don't know. All there are ideas and spirits, and we know both of them. So that's fine. But his point, you see, is that it makes skepticism and atheism a lot easier if you believe in matter. Once you get rid of matter, you've lost that source of skepticism. And so you can just go along with common sense and with received religion, and everything is fine. The point I'm making, of course, is, yeah, okay, that's fine, but that's all assuming that skepticism is wrong and that religion is true. That's all assuming that. Of course, if you are convinced that there is matter, and part of that will be that you're convinced that Berkeley's idealism is mistaken, so there's no alternative to matter, then you're going to be led into atheism. Because
why couldn't you be a skeptic?
What?
Why couldn't you be a skeptic under Berkeley's idealism and say, I don't believe that the experiences I'm having are real, something along those lines?
Well, here's the interesting point. If you do a brain in the vat skeptical scenario under Berkeley's system, so that would amount to saying, so here's what's going on. In my mind, I've got various perceptions of how the world is. And in fact, the world, it doesn't correspond to those perceptions. Now that translates in Berkeley's system to mean the ideas in God's mind are not the same as the ideas in my mind. So when I look out there and I see a red cup, I have the idea of a red cup. There is not now in God's mind an idea of a red cup, which I'm now corresponding to my idea. Okay, that's all right so far. But here's the problem with that. That means that God is allowing you to have ideas in your mind that don't correspond to ideas in his mind. And God would never do that, according to the idea that God's beneficent. You see, he wouldn't make the world that way, especially when he could have. It's within his power to make it so that we know about it. So he does, and that's why we do know about it. There's no skepticism. But if you do the brain in the vat scenario under the materialist hypothesis, there's nothing in matter which makes it, matter, have any interest in you being right about things. It's not beneficent. So it doesn't care whether you're wrong. And that's true, of course. It doesn't care. That's the truth about reality. It doesn't care.
But wouldn't that imply that like delusions, hallucinations, misconceptions, those would be impossible?
Well, that's a very interesting point that Berkeley has a bit of trouble with, you see. Because one of the things in this whole argument is whether is Berkeley's system itself defensible. I don't think it is, you see. I haven't gone into all that. I don't think it is. And Berkeley brings up some of the reasons why it's not. But that's one good reason. Why do we make mistakes like that? Why do our senses deceive us if God wouldn't deceive us? It doesn't make sense. You start to see how it's just not theologically defensible. It doesn't make a good metaphysics. So in the end, you see, Berkeley's system doesn't really work for various reasons. But he is right to say that if the materialist hypothesis were true, that would be inconsistent with with theism. Okay, it is inconsistent with it. And we can put it let me try and put it in a much more common sense kind of way. If you ask what's the picture of the universe that you get from the current materialistic view of the universe, it's that, well, there was all this stuff out there. It long predated any minds of any kind, human or animal, by billions of years. It was a mindless, pointless stuff, that there's nothing in there that's got anything to do with anything of concern to religion. Why would God create the world like that? And why would he wait so long before? Why would he create so much of this matter? Right? It doesn't fit the theological picture at all, the religious picture, the standard cosmology that we have. So the right thing to say would be, well, God wouldn't make a world like that, given what religion tells us are his intentions. It's far too redundant. It's been around for too long. It doesn't have the right nature. So yes, and so there's no God. Right. That's right. I think a lot of people have felt this. They feel that the picture that we have of the universe now is just not a picture in which God has any place. Not like the picture we used to have, where God created planet Earth, and his reason for that was to test us and give us the option of a moral life or an immoral life, and then send us to heaven or hell accordingly. And so the universe that we now believe in, the universe of matter, it's not consistent with that. That's why people really, really resisted the heliocentric hypothesis, when it came along, because it really does count against traditional religion. That's from an atheist point of view. Yes, we say, yeah, that's yet another argument. Anyway, that was my more recent thought about how actually this is yet another argument, really, for why atheism is unavoidable.
Gotcha. We have a question from the audience from Sebi. Yes.
No, an audience. We have an audience. Okay.
We do. 102 people are watching right now.
Really? Okay.
Please ask Colin who the most intelligent writer he has ever read is.
Am I meant to read this or hear it?
Oh, I'll read it to you. It says, he asks,
yes, read it to me, yeah.
Who is the most intelligent writer you have ever read?
Tell me, who is the most intelligent he has ever read is, okay. I love this question, actually. Two names come to my mind immediately. Then on a slight consideration, I have some further thoughts. The two writers who struck me in my lifetime as the most intelligent were Bertrand Russell and Vladimir Nabokov. Intelligence perhaps is not exactly the same way. Well, there's some overlaps. But if I go back more into writers who were around before I was around, then I actually wrote this on my blog recently. I think Berkeley is actually the most intelligent philosopher I've ever read, the cleverest. And I say this, of course, but I disagree completely with his views. But I think he's an amazingly clever writer, and he really anticipated analytical philosophy well before. People know he anticipated some of Wittgenstein's better ideas. But if you read his the dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, they're amazingly intelligent and resourceful and just outright clever. So I think those would count as some of my favorite. Descartes is ridiculously clever too. I mean, as a philosopher and a thinker.
I'm familiar with Russell. Who is the second guy you mentioned, and what did he write?
Russell.
No, I'm familiar with Russell. Well, the second guy was like a Russian name.
Well, you know Nabokov, who wrote Lolita.
Oh, gotcha.
That guy. I happen to be a big fan of all of Nabokov's writing. I used to teach Lolita in my philosophy and literature class, but since I retired, I've had more time to read. And I've read nearly everything by Nabokov, novels as well as his nonfiction, and he is an amazingly intelligent man. There's no question about that. Probably the best writer of English that ever. It's hard to beat as just a stylist. He's an amazing stylist. But he's a highly intelligent man. And the thing with Nabokov was he was not just an artist in the form of a poet and a novelist and so forth. He was a scientist, because he was a professional lepidopterist, and he actually had a job in the Harvard zoology department, or the Harvard Museum of Natural History. He was a scientist as well as anything else. So those are my two personal favorites.
Gotcha. DeFreak asked, were you ever a believer?
I was briefly a believer. I was brought up with religion at home, at school. We don't have separation of church and state in England, so we had what's called assembly, where we sang hymns and said prayers every single day. My family were not religious. There was no religion in our house, but it was at school. It was everywhere. So I was just a child. You can't say so. But I had a moment. I had a period of a year or so when I was studying divinity actually at school for A level, and I started finding it appealing at that time. Partly it was because it introduced me to philosophy and thinking about things in ethics and more carefully. You know, I was a young man, you know, this is when I was about 18. But after a relatively short time, it just struck me that reading Bertrand Russell was part of it, but it just struck me, to put it very straightforwardly, as nonsense when I got to about 20 years old. I didn't believe this stuff, you know. So that was it.
Boba Fett asks, what are your thoughts on Dostoevsky?
My thoughts on Dostoevsky are null, in the sense that I've read only one thing by Dostoevsky, The Gambler, and I've never felt any inclination to read Dostoevsky. It doesn't appeal to me. But the most important point is that Nabokov definitely derided and looked down on Dostoevsky, and so since he thinks he's not worth reading, I'm not going to put the time into it. Tolstoy is another matter. Tolstoy is, of course, a great genius.
Eris Gaming asks, how do you disprove all the other gods other than the Abrahamic ones?
Well, we'd have to go through case by case, wouldn't we? But, you know, gods come in different grades of godliness, don't they? I mean, in the Greek gods, they're not really gods in the way Christianity thinks of God. They're just like you know, impressive humans. We'd have to go through all the different cases of things, and we'd have to know whether or not what was called a god was really a god. And maybe some of these things which were called gods would turn out to be people, and then we wouldn't disprove them. They were just exceptional people, and they were called gods by the people around them because they were exceptional. I'm not sure. Can I think of any good examples? I don't know. Nowadays, people seem to have quite a strict separation between human and God. The Greeks didn't seem to have that separation. So how would we disprove the existence of the Greek gods? Never seen any.
Mansour asks, what do you think of the philosophy of the Quran?
I don't know anything about it.
Fair enough. All right. I think that is it for all the questions. We have been going for a little over an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
I think people can have a look at my blog, which is colinmcginn.net. And I have several articles on there about religion, disproofs of the existence of God. And I even have one paper about why the argument from evil might not be as convincing as people have always thought. I try to be very fair-minded about God, because I'm interested from a theoretical point of view, from a philosophical point of view. I'm interested in it. I think it raises good philosophical questions, you see. So I'm not, and that worth thinking about. So anyway, that would be my best recommendation.
Gotcha. Sebi actually asked a related question just now. He's like, what do you think are the biggest problems of the biggest philosophical issues of the 21st century?
They're probably the same as the biggest philosophical issues of the previous centuries, because there's not much, you know,
progress in philosophy.
I can tell you one. I think, I mean, the mind-body problem has become very central these days. When I was a graduate student, it was not regarded as all that central. Meaning was much more a central question when I was a graduate student, and it became much more fashionable in the last, I don't know, 20 years. So that's the big one people think of now. A problem I think is underestimated now, but was understood better earlier, is Plato's problem of a priori knowledge, which you know, he illustrated in the Meno by Socrates' questioning of the slave boy about Pythagoras' theorem. So the idea is, how do we know mathematics? How do we know logic? How do we know even ethics? And we seem to know them innately, not through the senses. And so then Plato had the question, well, how do we get that knowledge which we have innately? And he thought we existed in a disincarnate form before we occupied ordinary bodies. And so what Socrates did was remind the slave boy of what he knew in a previous life after being directly confronted by Platonic forms. That, of course, we now think of as an amazingly wacky theory. But I think that even today, we don't have any very good ideas about how innate knowledge arises. In fact, I have a whole book on this subject called Inborn Knowledge: The Mystery Within, in which I say basically two things: rationalism or innatism is true, A, and B, but we don't understand it. It's a mystery. It's true, but a mysterious truth. So I think that problem has not been discussed by philosophers in the 20th century very much at all. Innatism really came along. Chomsky made it more interesting to people in philosophy. But I think it's definitely something which should be thought about more.
Do you think that'd be related to the cuckoo bird, where the cuckoo lays an egg in a different bird's nest, and as soon as the hatchling comes out of the egg, it pushes out all the other eggs, and so it has to have some innate knowledge that the other eggs are bad or taking up space or something. It has to want to push them out of the nest, and so it has some kind of innate knowledge that's parted to it biologically to want to push the eggs out of the nest.
Yeah.
Could the same thing apply to our a priori concepts, math, logic, reason, those kind of things?
Well, one thing you might try to think is, first of all, it's a good idea to think about instincts. An instinct, though, like the one you described, is much more like a sensory motor disposition, and of course, it's hardwired into the genes of the animal. In our case, you see, what we have is things like mathematical knowledge, and the idea of innatism is that that's in our genes, in our DNA, and as we mature, it develops in our bodies, in our brains, and we get to the point where it appears in our minds, and then we start understanding and knowing mathematical truths and seeing that they're necessary. And of course, the field of mathematics is a huge abstract field, and all of this is based on innate programs, or whatever we're going to call them. It's not like a sensory motor routine. It seems to be something which just grows in us and yields this massive amount of knowledge. And that knowledge, of course, involves knowledge of various entities like numbers, and how does this all happen? Why did it happen in evolution is a big question too. What mutation was left in our genes, but how is it stored, you see? So in some way or other, the genes have to store this, just as they store the skeleton, of the organism in question. They have to encode it somehow. So the genes have got to encode all this a priori knowledge. How does that? It seems mind-boggling how that could even happen. If you're an empiricist, you see, then things are very different. Then it's a blank slate, and J.S. Mill thought this. You just see groups of objects and you abstract from them concepts of number. And okay, now that's a very sketchy story they had, and not a plausible one either. But if you're convinced that that's wrong, as you should be, then you say, well, it must be innate then. Well, in the days of Descartes and Leibniz, they had a theory about how this knowledge gets into us, which is into the soul, they would say, in our, we would say the nervous system. God puts it there. That's how it gets there. And there's no other way to explain it, you see. Because given what's there, you need something pretty impressive to put it there. But we don't have that option. So how does it get there, and how is it encoded, and how does it develop? It's quite mysterious.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going. It's about 12 o'clock, so that's the time we have. Really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Thanks again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, and I enjoyed it. And this is going to be on YouTube, is it?
Yep, and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn.
How long till it comes on?
It's already on. It's on right now. That's why we have an audience.
Oh, fantastic! Right. I think we did. I think we covered the ground, and it's all good.
Cool. Thanks again.